The 7th of December, 1941, 7:02 a.m., Opana Point, Oahu, Hawaii. The morning air hung thick with salt and tropical warmth as Private Joseph Lockhart adjusted the oscilloscope before him, watching the green phosphorescent line sweep across the circular screen in hypnotic rhythm. Beside him, Private George Elliott leaned forward, squinting at what appeared to be a massive return echo blooming on the radar, display a blip so large it seemed impossible, almost laughable. The SCR-270 mobile radar unit, positioned on a makeshift platform carved into the northern tip of Oahu, hummed with electrical life, its rotating antenna sweeping the Pacific horizon, with invisible fingers reaching more than 100 miles into the empty sky. Neither man could know that the glowing signature before them represented 183 Japanese aircraft, their engines roaring in tight formation, their pilots utterly unaware that they had already been seen by an eye that transcended the limitations of human vision. The green glow reflected in Lockhart's eyes as he noted the time and distance. 7:02 a.m., 136 miles north, 3 degrees east. In that moment, separated by an ocean of air and intention, two technological realities collided, the ancient art of the surprise attack meeting the nascent science of electromagnetic detection. The pilots of Carrier Striking Task Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, flew in precise formations that morning, each man confident in the absolute secrecy of their mission. They had maintained radio silence for 13 days, crossing 3,500 miles of empty Pacific from Hitokapu Bay in the Kuril Islands, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial observation. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, leading the first wave in his Nakajima B-5N2 torpedo bomber, had studied American capabilities for months. Japanese intelligence had meticulously documented American radar installations, dismissing them as experimental curiosities, temperamental machines that rarely functioned properly and were manned by inexperienced operators who couldn't distinguish between aircraft and atmospheric disturbances. The pre-dawn briefing aboard the carrier Akagi had reinforced this certainty. American radar, if operational at all, would be turned off on a Sunday morning, and even if some junior technician happened to be monitoring, the installations were positioned to watch for threats from the southwest, not the north. The element of surprise was mathematically assured, a calculated certainty built on intelligence reports, captured documents, and the fundamental assumption that Americans, comfortable in their island paradise, would never imagine an attack from across the northern Pacific. Yet at 7:02 that morning, the universe of Japanese tactical planning collided with a reality none of their intelligence officers had predicted. The two privates at Opana Point were supposed to shut down their equipment at 7 a.m., their training shift complete. But Lockhart, the more experienced operator, had decided to give Elliott additional practice time. It was this minor deviation from schedule, this small act of mentorship and diligence, that placed them before their screen when the massive formation appeared. The return was so large that Elliott initially suspected equipment malfunction. Surely no flight of aircraft could produce such a signature. Lockhart confirmed the reading, checked the equipment, and confirmed again. At 7:20 a.m., after 18 minutes of tracking the approaching contact, Lockhart telephoned the information center at Fort Shafter, reaching Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, the lone officer on duty that morning. Tyler, informed that a large flight was approaching from the north, made a decision that would echo through history. Assuming the contact was a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California that morning, he uttered 5 words that would be dissected in countless investigations. Don't worry about it. What Tyler didn't know, what couldn't be communicated through the primitive reporting system that December morning, was the unprecedented scale of what Lockhart and Elliott were observing. The radar signature represented more than 50 tons of aircraft, hundreds of men, and thousands of pounds of ordnance moving at 180 miles per hour toward an unsuspecting harbor. The Japanese pilots, meanwhile, flew in complete confidence, watching the sun rise over their right wings, adjusting their courses based on visual navigation and radio beacons, carelessly left active by Hawaiian commercial stations. They expected to achieve what they had achieved so brilliantly at Port Arthur in 1904, and what they had executed with brutal efficiency in China, the decisive surprise strike that cripples an enemy before war is even declared. Not one pilot in that formation understood that their surprise had been compromised before they crossed the horizon, that electromagnetic echoes had betrayed their presence while they were still too far away to see with the naked eye, that the theoretical possibility of radar detection had become operational reality. The technological revolution, represented by that radar contact at Opana Point, was rooted in decades of scientific development that most military officers barely understood. The principle of radio detection and ranging radar had emerged from experiments by German physicist Heinrich Hertz in the 1880 seconds, proving that electromagnetic waves could be reflected by metallic objects. British, German, and American researchers had independently pursued the military applications throughout the 1930 seconds, driven by the nightmare scenario that had haunted military planners since the previous war. How do you detect enemy aircraft before they appear over your cities? The British, facing the existential threat of German air attack, had developed the chain-home radar network by 1938, a string of coastal stations that could detect approaching Luftwaffe formations while they were still over France. The American development had been slower, more experimental, hampered by inter-service rivalry and peacetime budgets. The SCR-270 that Lockhart and Elliott operated that morning was a compromise solution, mobile, relatively affordable, but temperamental and difficult to interpret. Japanese military intelligence was aware of radar. They had captured documents mentioning British radar systems. Their analysts had noted references to American experiments. But their assessment concluded that radar was too primitive, too unreliable, too dependent on skilled operators to pose a significant threat. This assessment wasn't entirely wrong. The American radar network in Hawaii was incomplete, poorly integrated, and staffed by personnel who had received minimal training. The information center at Fort Shafter was designed to process radar contacts and coordinate fighter response, but it operated on a skeleton crew, and on Sunday mornings it barely operated at all. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor wasn't that radar failed to detect the attack, it was that the detection was dismissed, misinterpreted, lost in a system that wasn't ready to believe what its technology was reporting. Commander Fuchida, leading his formation toward Oahu, had no inkling of the radar detection. At 7:40 a.m., he broke radio silence, transmitting the code 222, the abbreviation for Totsuge Kiseo, charge. At 7:49 a.m., his radio operator transmitted Tora, 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 Tiger, 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 the code phrase, indicating that complete surprise had been achieved. The irony was absolute. Surprise had not been achieved. The Japanese formation had been detected, tracked, and reported. But the institutional failure to act on that detection meant that, for all practical purposes, the attack proceeded exactly as if radar didn't exist. The technological capability had functioned perfectly. The human system had failed completely. The first bombs fell on Wheeler Field at 7:51 a.m. 0 fighters swept low over Hickam Field, machine guns chattering, shredding parked aircraft. Torpedo bombers dropped into their attack runs on Battleship Row, skimming barely above the water, their torpedoes modified for shallow harbor depth. Dive bombers screamed down on the battleship Nevada, on the cruisers and destroyers, on the oil storage tanks. The carefully planned attack unfolded with the precision of a mechanical process, each element timed and coordinated. Japanese pilots, many of whom had combat experience over China, executed their attacks with professional efficiency. They expected anti-aircraft fire. Of course, you couldn't attack a military base without expecting some resistance. But they expected to arrive undetected, to catch the Americans sleeping, to deliver the first blows before defensive systems could even begin to respond. What they didn't expect, what they couldn't have anticipated, was that somewhere in the chaos of burning ships and exploding magazines, American officers were already asking the question that would transform modern warfare. How did they get so close without being detected? Within hours, as fires still burned and rescue parties pulled survivors from capsized hulls, officers were reviewing the morning's radar logs. The plot from Opana Point was retrieved, analyzed, and suddenly understood. The Japanese hadn't slipped past American defenses through some brilliant feat of navigation or meteorological luck. They had been detected more than an hour before the attack began. The failure wasn't technological, it was organizational, interpretive, human. The psychological impact of this realization rippled through the American military with profound effect. For Japanese military planners, the attack on Pearl Harbor seemed to confirm everything they believed about American weakness. The Americans were complacent, unprepared, technically inferior. Vice Admiral Nagumo withdrew his carriers without launching a third wave, satisfied that he had achieved a decisive victory. Japanese newspapers celebrated the brilliant surprise attack. Emperor Hirohito praised the successful operation. The strategic assumption underlying the entire attack that a devastating surprise blow would shatter American morale and force a negotiated peace seemed validated by the smoking ruins in Pearl Harbor. But in American radar laboratories, training centers, and planning rooms, a different understanding was taking shape. Radar had worked. The fundamental technology had functioned exactly as designed. The problem wasn't the capability to detect enemy aircraft at long range, it was the system for interpreting that detection, communicating it, and acting on it. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the American military began a crash program to expand radar coverage, improve operator training, and integrate radar into a comprehensive command and control system. The lesson wasn't that radar failed at Pearl Harbor, it was that radar succeeded, but the military system around it had failed to keep pace with technological capability. The SCR-270 radar that detected the Japanese strike force became a symbol, a technological artifact that represented both failure and promise. Military historians would later note that Pearl Harbor was the last major naval attack in history to be attempted without the assumption that enemy radar would detect it. Every subsequent carrier operation, every amphibious assault, every strategic bombing campaign would be planned with the understanding that electromagnetic detection had fundamentally changed the nature of surprise. The sky had become transparent in a way that no tactician of the previous generation could have imagined. The ancient art of approaching undetected, of using weather and darkness and geography to conceal movement, had been rendered obsolete by oscilloscopes and rotating antennas. For Japanese pilots who survived Pearl Harbor and continued fighting through 1942 and 1943, the reality of American radar became impossible to ignore. At the Battle of Midway in June 1942, Japanese strike aircraft were detected and tracked long before they came within visual range of American carriers. Fighter directors aboard American ships vectored defending fighters to intercept incoming attacks with uncanny precision. Japanese pilots, accustomed to the chaotic improvisation of visual combat, found themselves meeting organized resistance miles from their targets. The Americans seemed to know they were coming before they arrived, not through lucky reconnaissance or broken codes alone, but through some invisible detection capability that operated regardless of weather, darkness, or visibility. The experience of Lieutenant Zenji Abe, a Zero fighter pilot who flew at both Pearl Harbor and Midway, illustrated the psychological transformation. At Pearl Harbor, Abe had strafed Hickam Field without encountering any organized resistance until after the attack was well underway. At Midway, his formation was intercepted 40 miles from the American carriers by Wildcat fighters that appeared to have been waiting specifically for them. In his post-war memoir, Abe described the eerie sensation of being watched by invisible eyes, of knowing that somewhere below the clouds, American sailors were tracking his exact position on glowing screens. The confidence that had characterized his Pearl Harbor attack, the certainty that Japanese skill and surprise would overwhelm American unpreparedness, evaporated into a grim understanding that the Americans possessed technical capabilities that Japanese intelligence had fundamentally underestimated. By 1943, American radar technology had evolved far beyond the experimental SCR-270. Shipboard radar directed anti-aircraft fire with mathematical precision. Airborne radar allowed night fighters to locate and track enemy aircraft in complete darkness. Ground control intercept stations could vector defending fighters onto incoming raids regardless of visibility. The electromagnetic spectrum had become a contested battle space, as important as the air itself. Japanese pilots began to report that American ships seemed to know their exact position, even in the middle of night attacks, that American fighters could find them in clouds and darkness, that the element of surprise had become almost impossible to achieve. The symbolic weight of that December morning when two privates at Opana Point tracked an approaching attack force that should have been invisible grew heavier as the war progressed. American military training films showed radar operators at their screens, emphasizing that vigilance and technical skill could prevent another Pearl Harbor. The narrative of technological superiority became embedded in American military culture. Radar wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of American industrial and scientific capability, proof that democratic society could innovate faster and more effectively than fascist militarism. The fact that radar had detected the Pearl Harbor attack, even though the system failed to respond, became a bittersweet validation. American technology had worked, and with proper organization, it would ensure that such a surprise could never happen again. For Japanese military leadership, the growing awareness of American radar superiority was deeply troubling. Japan had its own radar research programs, but they lagged years behind American and British developments. Japanese industry struggled to produce radar sets in meaningful quantities. Training was inadequate. Integration into tactical doctrine was superficial. By 1944, the gulf between American and Japanese radar capabilities had become a chasm. American night fighters, equipped with airborne radar, routinely intercepted Japanese bombers over the Pacific, destroying them before they could reach their targets. American submarines used radar to locate Japanese convoys in darkness and bad weather, then attack with devastating efficiency. Japanese pilots, trained to fight with visual reference and excellent natural eyesight, found themselves outmatched by Americans who could see with electronics. The ultimate expression of radar's transformation of warfare came in the strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself. American B-29 bombers, attacking from bases in the Marianas, were tracked by Japanese radar from the moment they took off. But Japanese fighter defenses, hamstrung by fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and inadequate radar-directed control systems, proved unable to mount effective resistance. American radar picket ships positioned around Japan detected approaching Japanese aircraft and vectored defending fighters to intercept them. The electromagnetic battlefield had become as important as physical geography, and in that invisible dimension, American technical superiority was absolute. The green glow of the oscilloscope at Opana Point, that hypnotic sweep of the radar beam painting electronic pictures of an approaching attack, had represented a fundamental transition in human warfare. For thousands of years, the advantage in battle had belonged to the side that could approach unseen, that could mass forces in secret, that could achieve surprise through deception and careful timing. Alexander's phalanx, Genghis Khan's cavalry, Napoleon's corps, all had relied on the fundamental limitation of human perception. You couldn't see an enemy beyond the horizon. Even aerial reconnaissance in World War I had only marginally extended that horizon. But radar had made the sky transparent. It had turned the electromagnetic spectrum into a medium of detection and communication. It had made surprise the ancient foundation of tactical advantage exponentially more difficult to achieve. Private Joseph Lockhart, the radar operator who tracked the Japanese formation for those crucial minutes before the attack, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal for his actions that morning. But he would later reflect that he and Private Elliott had simply done what they were trained to do, operate the equipment, and report what they observed. The technology had worked perfectly. The tragic failure was that the military system wasn't prepared to believe what the technology was telling it. In a sense, Pearl Harbor represented not the failure of American radar, But its premature success, the technology had evolved faster than military doctrine, faster than command structures, faster than human imagination could adapt to the possibility of seeing beyond the horizon. The Japanese pilots who flew back to their carriers that morning, their aircraft perforated by anti-aircraft fire, their formations depleted by combat losses, believed they had achieved a brilliant tactical victory. They had sunk battleships, destroyed aircraft, killed thousands of Americans. They had executed a surprise attack that would be studied in military academies for generations. But they had no idea that their approach had been detected and tracked, that their surprise had been technologically compromised, even if organizationally it had succeeded. They couldn't know that the smoking ruins of Pearl Harbor contained the seed of their ultimate defeat, the realization by American military leadership that technological detection, properly integrated into command systems, would make future surprise attacks almost impossible. In the years after Pearl Harbor, as American factories produced radar sets by the thousands, as operators were trained by the tens of thousands, as radar became as fundamental to military operations as maps and compasses, the attack on Hawaii was reframed in American military mythology. It became not just a story of surprise and tragedy, but a story about the importance of technological vigilance, about the need to trust and act on technical intelligence, about the danger of dismissing anomalous data because it doesn't fit expectations. The green blip on the oscilloscope at Opana Point became a symbol of opportunity. Missed but lesson learned the proof that seeing wasn't enough. You had to understand what you were seeing and act on that understanding with institutional courage. The recurring image of that radar screen, the phosphorescent sweep, the blooming return echo, the two young privates, staring at evidence of approaching doom that would not be believed, carried symbolic weight far beyond that December morning. It represented the collision of human expectation with technological capability, the tragedy of information without action, the transformation of warfare from a contest of visible forces to a contest of invisible detection. Every radar operator who sat, watch in the decades that followed, staring at similar screens in Korea, Vietnam, in the Cold War, listening posts that ringed the Soviet Union, carried the ghost of Opana Point with them, the knowledge that vigilance mattered, that technology could provide warning, but that warning only had value if someone was prepared to believe it and act. For the Japanese military, the revelation of American radar capability, slow to be understood, painful to be acknowledged, represented a fundamental miscalculation about American technological capacity. Japanese pre-war intelligence had assumed that Americans, comfortable and individualistic, would lack the discipline and focus to develop advanced military technology. The radar that tracked the Pearl Harbor strike force proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. American industry, American scientific research, American technical education, all the attributes that Japanese militarists had dismissed as signs of decadent democracy, had produced a technological advantage that would prove decisive. The sound that Joseph Lockhart heard that morning, the electrical hum of the SCR-270, the static of electromagnetic waves being transmitted and received, the faint background noise of tropical morning filtering through the open-sided tent that housed the radar installation, became part of the auditory mythology of Pearl Harbor. That sound represented vigilance, technology, the possibility of prevention. In American military culture, it stood as a reminder that technology alone isn't sufficient. It must be integrated into systems, believed by commanders, acted upon with urgency. The tragedy of Pearl Harbor wasn't that America lacked the technology to detect the attack. It was that America lacked the institutional maturity to trust and act on what its technology was revealing. By war's end, when American B-29 seconds flew over Tokyo, guided by radar navigation, when American fighters equipped with airborne radar hunted Japanese aircraft in darkness, when American ships used radar-directed fire control to destroy kamikaze attacks before they reached their targets, the technological advantage had become overwhelming. Japanese pilots, many of whom had flown in the Pearl Harbor attack, found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to possess supernatural awareness. They couldn't know that what seemed like magic was simply the systematic application of electromagnetic physics, the industrial production of radar sets, and the training of thousands of operators who had learned the lessons that should have been learned on the 7th of December, 1941. The epilogue to the radar detection at Opana Point was written not in days or months but in decades. The transparent sky created by radar fundamentally altered strategic planning. The possibility of surprise attack diminished but never disappeared. The Cold War would be defined by radar networks, the distant early warning line, the Soviet equivalent, the constant electronic vigil watching for missiles and bombers that, thankfully, never came. Every satellite launch, every missile test, every military aircraft that crosses international boundaries is tracked by electromagnetic sensors that are direct descendants of that SCR-270 that hummed on a Hawaiian hillside in 1941. When modern historians examine the Pacific War, the green glow of that oscilloscope appears as a turning point as significant as any battle. It represented the moment when traditional surprise attack confronted technological detection and found that the age of invisible approach had ended. Japanese pilots expected to arrive undetected because that was how naval attacks had always worked. You approached beyond the horizon, you struck before you were seen, you achieved surprise through distance and timing. But on the 7th of December, 1941, they were detected 136 miles out, more than an hour before the first bomb fell. They flew into a trap that should have been sprung but wasn't, a defensive system that had seen them but failed to act. That failure taught America lessons that would reshape modern warfare. The philosophical irony was profound. Japanese military culture emphasized wa, harmony through submission to collective will, the suppression of individual interpretation in favor of group consensus. American culture, which Japanese militarists viewed as chaotically individualistic, had produced two young privates who stayed at their post past their assigned time, who trusted their technical observation over expectations, who reported what they saw even when it seemed impossible. That individual initiative, Lockhart deciding to give Elliot extra training time, both men trusting their equipment and their interpretation, despite the scale of the contact, represented exactly the kind of decentralized decision-making that democratic systems fostered and that authoritarian militarism struggled to understand. The green line sweeping across the oscilloscope, painting electronic pictures of approaching aircraft, had revealed a deeper truth about technological warfare. Information is only as valuable as the system's ability to interpret and act on it. Japan had achieved tactical surprise at Pearl Harbor despite being detected because American command systems weren't prepared to believe that an attack could come from the north on a Sunday morning. But that failure sparked a transformation in American military culture, a commitment to trust technical intelligence, to integrate technology into command decisions, to build systems that could translate electronic detection into tactical response. In the decades after Pearl Harbor, veterans of the Pacific War would sometimes reflect on the strange providence of that morning that two radar operators happened to be at their post, that their equipment happened to be functioning perfectly, that the Japanese approach happened to be detected with such clarity that no equipment malfunction could be blamed. It was as if the universe had provided a warning that couldn't be missed, only to watch as human systems failed to recognize the gift they'd been given. The lesson was harsh, but transformative. See clearly, believe what you see, and act with the courage to trust technology over expectation. The electromagnetic spectrum, invisible to human senses, had become the most contested battlefield of modern war. The pilots who flew toward Pearl Harbor that December morning flew in a universe that was fundamentally different from what they imagined. They believed they were invisible, protected by distance and surprise. They were wrong. They had been seen, tracked, measured, and reported. That they weren't intercepted, that the attack succeeded despite being detected, was a temporary failure of human systems, not a validation of Japanese tactical theory. The transparent sky created by radar would define every air battle that followed. The age of surprise attack launched from beyond the horizon had ended at 7:02 a.m. on the 7th of December 1941, even if it took the rest of the war for everyone to understand that fundamental truth. The green glow of radar, impersonal, electronic, unhuman, had become the symbol of a new kind of vigilance, a watchfulness that never slept, never blinked, never looked away. It represented the transformation of warfare from a contest of human perception to a contest of technological awareness. And for the Japanese pilots who flew toward Hawaii that morning, confident in their surprise, it marked the beginning of a war that would be fought and lost in dimensions they barely understood, on battlefields that couldn't be seen with human eyes, against an enemy whose greatest strength wasn't courage or discipline, but the systematic application of science to the problems of detection, communication, and coordinated response. The invisible eye had seen them coming. That it failed to stop them was the tragedy of Pearl Harbor. That it would never fail again was the promise that transformed modern warfare and marked the end of an age when approaching undetected was simply a matter of choosing the right moment and the right route. The sky had become transparent, and with that transparency, the nature of warfare itself had fundamentally changed forever.